Hello, I'm back. So Angie and I actually work together over at Ethical Intelligence. Ethical Intelligence is a collective of independent consultants in AI ethics and responsible AI. This is the first time Angie and I get to meet in person too, so this is fun. Normally we do this through a Zoom screen, so we get to do this live now, which is very fun. And one of our defaults at Ethical Intelligence is to always approach AI, ethics, everything with a sense of curiosity. And that's what we're going to do here now in a nice little fireside chat. So, Angie, my first curious question for you then. So we're talking a lot about how AI is changing the face of how we're working. And then on top of it, we're trying to add on this another layer of responsible AI and ethics. But really, from your point of view, is that layer of ethics and responsible AI really that different? Does it require such a big change as it kind of is portrayed on top of a whole nother change of AI?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Actually, you talk about ethics, I kind of feel the tension almost in the room. Like people are like, oh my God, if I don't pay attention here, am I unethical? Is that what that means? So I think just to dispel that kind of fear, look, when we talk about ethical, when we talk about responsible, what we're talking about is a pathway to kind of risk mitigation and innovation development and success. Actually, that's what we're trying to kind of move towards. So I kind of want to kind of take the scariness out of it. But I think if you weren't implementing technology in your organization in a really thorough, frameworked way, if you weren't really thinking ahead of time about all of the potential risk, if you weren't thinking about how you build diversity and inclusion into your development teams, because that's important to how you think about the outcomes. If you weren't doing all of that, then now is the moment actually to harness that in your organization, to start thinking about it, because the risks are increasing. And, I think the point was made earlier around, all of you in this room have spent a lot of time, your organizations have a huge amount of history behind them and trust. And actually, there's a moment now where potentially you can damage that trust, damage that reputation at scale. And that's, I think, what AI potentially brings is the scale. So it's a moment to think about, if I wasn't rigorous and thorough in that process before, I really need to double down on that today, because it's going to be absolutely critical. So I think that's the point. But a lot, I think, organisations here and elsewhere are already doing that. So it doesn't feel like a big change.
Exactly. It's kind of like, oh, here's my flavor of my AI strategy. I have the responsible AI flavor to this strategy. And it's one built with that long-term view, instead of saying, we're going to use AI and kind of running all over the place and it's the Wild West of what are we doing. Responsible AI, that flavor of a strategy really brings in the clarity for a long-term vision that's going to stand the test of time, rather than a quick fix now of we need to have ourselves covered.
Yeah. And if you're thinking about making a change in your organization, I'm going to change my operating platform, maybe I'm going to change, I'm introducing new technology, all of that. You go through a project plan and you just start to think about, like, what do I need to do? Who do I need to include? What people are involved? What's my process? What technology, how do I need to change the technology? And that's absolutely no different, I think, in your approach to AI. But I think there are some specific nuances, particularly when we start to think about bias and we start to think about choice of technology as well. And we haven't kind of talked about that yet. So I think that's quite an interesting debate to have as well. But I think it becomes really important.
Exactly. Well, I want to run us through actually and make AI maybe a little less scary, hopefully. One of the biggest use cases at this point in day, around generative AI in the publishing industry is actually using these LLMs to generate short form text, and especially in lower lift content. And so I want to use that actually as our little bit of framework. Okay. We're going to run with that use case, and we're going to run through actually people, process, technology of what that approach would look like in incorporating this kind of use case into your practices. So, Angie, let's start with the people.
Oh, okay.
I just threw everything at you.
Okay. All right. It feels like kind of we're going to give you kind of the playbook for running through. And I think probably the first point I'd make is we're going to talk about people, process and technology. But actually, also probably what's really important is you're not alone. If any of you are in the room today thinking, you know, I don't really know what this is going to mean for my teams. I don't really know how to integrate. I don't really know where to move forward, or I've been asked to run a project and I don't know where to start. Then actually the good news is there are lots of kind of frameworks out there to help and support you. So this is a reasonably well trodden path at this point.
Yes.
So I would absolutely encourage you to look at your particular field, because I know we've got quite a variety kind of in the room today, and think about what potential risk assessment frameworks or AI adoption frameworks that you can potentially apply to your business. And they're going to give you a really nice steer in what are the kind of components I need to look at, and then you can start to tailor that for your organization. So I guess the first thing is you're not alone. This is a trodden path, and there is support out there for you that you can go and access. And a lot of those frameworks are domain specific. So so have a good look around, and you'll be able to find those. But just talking specifically around our examples, so thinking about generative AI application, probably the first thing you're going to think about is from a people perspective, well, who are my stakeholders? Who do I need to have involved? And actually, probably one of the areas I just mentioned a little bit earlier is like, who is in the room making some of the decisions about the way that we move forward? And this is a moment, we talk a lot in AI about diversity inclusion. And the reason that we do that is because we have an absolute catalogue of disasters behind us from an AI perspective. And I teach some of these on MBA courses currently, of organisations where you didn't have the right people in the room at the start. Actually, you end up with a kind of catalogue of unintended outcomes coming out at the end. And when Anna shared with us earlier around who's frightened, who's nervous about AI, some of those numbers, actually, it's some of those marginal groups actually that feel most afraid about AI, and probably quite rightly, because those are the groups actually that have probably been the victim of some of the unintended outcomes actually of AI implementation in the past. So they have every right to feel quite nervous, because number one, they're probably not in the room being party to the development and the way that we're designing the world moving forward, but also quite often they turn out the losers at the end point, and lots of examples. If you want to read Kate Crawford's book, highly recommend it. There's lots of examples in there for you to read. She's data lead for Microsoft. But I want to come back to you. There's so much to talk about. I want to come back to your specifics. So from a people perspective, lots to think about. Who are your stakeholders? Who's involved? Who makes decisions? Who might need to be involved that perhaps hasn't been part of your decision-making process before? And from a development perspective, have you got a really diverse and inclusive teams? Because actually you may start to need to include people from across your business that perhaps you potentially hadn't engaged with before.
One of the things that I always say is our technology is a reflection of our humanity, and humanity is a beautiful mess. And so we need to ensure that we're opening up that kind of thinking. We have a diversity of thought, we have a diversity of experience. AI doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, the use case and the business model that supports the use of these tools is just as important, if not more important, than the tool itself in terms of impact of outcome. And so we need to be pulling in people from different parts of the business. We need to be pulling in people from different experiences, different backgrounds, different perspectives, in order to be able to fully reflect the complexity of our human nature into our use of these tools for success. So it's absolutely imperative. Yeah,
and if you think about from a publishing perspective in terms of point of view, I think you've got kind of got that contextual check actually around, well, if I'm generating, and our example is, you know, generating kind of short form text, actually is that text reflective of the feel and tone? And actually who do you have in the room that's kind of understanding what that tone and context is going to be? So actually you really need that input to be able to tailor, I think, your implementation for what feels right for you as an organization as well.
Exactly. So we covered people, and I know we can just keep diving further and further into people, but I also know that we have limited time on the stage. So we're going to move up to process and really looking at the operational infrastructure that exists within a company. You know, those governance frameworks, we were talking about how there are plenty of different risk assessments and frameworks available that you can find out there. You can find that kind of, well, let's say guidelines, but then when it comes to implementing these tools on the process level, on the how we're doing it, what kind of operational infrastructure are we looking at here?
Ooh, Yeah.
I know, loaded question there.
So I think, I guess the place that I would start from a process perspective is starting to think about the guardrails. And I thought David talked about this really nicely actually in his presentation, touched on that. So how do you think about what are the kind of rails that you need to put in place that perhaps were natural and integral to the way that you operated previously? So in a human only process, so I have copywriters, they're producing copy, there might be a natural kind of check within that process. But actually, if you're moving to an automated process, we've talked about, well, making sure that we've got the tone and contextually that's right. What does that process look like in terms of authorization or escalation, and who's in the loop for that process, and what does that look like? And are we using automated tools to check that, or actually at what point do we trigger a human intervention, and where do those points occur? So actually, what am I building from a process perspective that's going to drive the efficiency that I want? I don't just want to create more intervention for the sake of intervention. I actually want to drive some efficiency in my business. But where do I need to put those kind of guardrails in place to make sure that actually we're capturing at the right moment if there's going to be a problem?
And Angie, I've watched team after team kind of get frozen in place when they don't have the guardrails, where they're sitting there going, I can use this tool like this, but am I doing the right thing? And they can almost you can lock teams down into this sense of fear if you're not giving them those guidelines to help them move forward efficiently. Oftentimes with ethics, people think, oh, it's a blocker. No, really, it unlocks the ability for teams to move forward with confidence because they know what they're operating within.
Yeah, and it's not fixed, right? You're going to figure it out as you go along.
Exactly.
Actually, those probably are going to evolve, just like your policies in any organization are going to evolve. So the key thing is your starting point, feeling confident about that starting point, and then actually kind of evolving and reviewing that. And now part of your review process is part of your operating plan.
Exactly. Responsible AI is not a 1 and 0 yes or no. It is a process itself. You will grow that muscle really within your organization over time. So we got process, we did people, we did process. Now let's actually talk about AI and the tools, since we keep talking around it this entire time. But when we're looking at these actual tools themselves, we're bringing them into companies, and we need to understand, the data, the domain that they're operating in, the documentation, what tools are actually at use within your company. There's lots to consider just on the technology itself.
Yeah, and actually probably the starting point is how do you make that choice? Because I think it's quite interesting debate, I think, rumbling away kind of in the background around closed source and open source. And if you've read any of the kind of Meta position on this, the OpenAI position on this, very conflicting in terms of how they think about model development and think about transparency. So as an organization, you might actually have some strong views about, do I want a model that's transparent and open, that I can run within my own infrastructure, that actually I have some level of control over? Or do I want the security and safety of an API approach where actually there is no transparency on the model, but I feel secure in that if there's a problem, I'm not owning that problem, actually that problem's being managed at source. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that kind of like Meta are taking the kind of open, very transparent route, and OpenAI, ironically, are kind of closed. Broadly speaking, others sit on that spectrum too. But there are I think some quite interesting discussions to be had internally within the business around actually what's going to be the right approach for you. Typically, not in this audience today, but typically talking more broadly from a sector perspective, there are many industries and sectors that actually where housing the model and having the data in-house from a data security perspective is particularly important, where you wouldn't want to API. But actually there are probably in our field that we're talking about today, that's more of a philosophical choice around the direction that you want to go. So that's probably your opening point around the technology. And then you're thinking, well, what is my problem statement in my organization? Mm-hmm. Where's my bottleneck? What is the problem that I want to solve? And is there an AI application for that? So typically you and I probably see organizations starting with AI, and actually we want them very much to go back and start with their business challenge and say, well, actually, what am I trying to fix? What am I trying to solve? And then actually working towards the technology to fix that.
AI is not a magic wand. If you don't know the problem that you're trying to fix, bringing in AI is going to create more problems, not try and solve the mystical problem itself.
Yeah.
So it's very important. And I want to touch a little bit more actually on the procurement part that you're bringing up here, Angie, specifically because the majority of us in this room will not be building these large models, but we will be users of them. So what point do we have control over? Because I know there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of skepticism of I don't have control over that model and how it's being built. What we do have control over is the procurement process and understanding the suppliers that we look for, looking for actual value alignment with those suppliers themselves. That establishes the trust. If you're operating similar to how we're operating, I can at least trust that our values aren't going to come head to head.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think Anna touched on this in her presentation as well around the deployment at Ipsos around using different models. And I think that's a really interesting approach. And I advocate that approach. In fact, one I took myself in Meta, controversially, of running different models in the business, not just Llama, actually looking at potentially domain-specific application and where the models might perform better, because they are actually very different. So I think it is worth doing that level of testing. So you might have a philosophical around open architecture versus closed, but also you might want to test across the different models. In this particular field as well, I think David kind of touched on it a little bit as well around, we're at a juncture around trying to figure out what information is training these models. So I think it's interesting from a publishing perspective around what potentially is open to crawlers to see and to train against, and what potentially is paywalled and closed. And there very much is a feeling, very much a feeling from outside of the industry, and I would count myself in that outside of the industry, that potentially we're seeing models very much trained on open access, and the open access media looks very different to the paywalled media. So there's definitely, I think, a challenge in the industry around how do we ensure these models are being trained against a wide corpus of data as opposed to a very fixed data. And David just touched on some of the legal wranglings around licensing. But I think that's going to be very important for how we feel about using the tools in this industry.
Absolutely. So as you're hearing, there's lots that we're covering quite quickly here, but we're working through layers. We're working through the people, the process, the technology. There's ways to sort what feels quite chaotic and like a cacophony of all these things to consider.